The city hadn't noticed his presence for years. He was a shadow among shadows, an inconspicuous figure in a crowd, a man whose face was forgotten within minutes of being seen. This invisibility had once been his greatest weapon. Now it had become his prison, Edward Murphy, a name that meant nothing to anyone except the passport officer and the tax inspector. 62 years old, graying temples, thin-rimmed glasses, an apartment on the 3rd floor of an old building with peeling plaster. No one knew that his hands, now trembling with illness, had once worked with surgical precision. That his eyes, now dull and tired, had once missed no detail. That the man his neighbors believed to be a former librarian was the author of crimes that had shaken the city 20 years ago. The diagnosis sounded like a death sentence. Amyotrophic lateral sclerosis, a disease that would slowly take away his control over his own body, turn him into a prisoner within himself. The doctor said something about deadlines, about palliative care, about dignity in the last days. Edward listened and thought about something else, about those who never knew why their loved ones did not come home, about those who lived for decades with unanswered questions. He wrote the first letter that same evening. The handwriting, once flawless, now trembled treacherously, but the words fell on the paper with frightening clarity. Not a confession, not a plea for forgiveness, just facts, cold and precise as a scalpel. Date, place, name of the victim, details that could not have been known to anyone but the killer and the police. "I'm not asking for understanding or sympathy," he wrote. "I'm not looking for redemption. I just want the truth not to die with me." He sent a letter to the Daily Chronicle, not the city's largest but the most independent newspaper. No return address, no signature, just the facts and a promise. This is just the beginning. 3 days later, the city exploded. The headlines screamed about a sensation, about a confession of a killer, about the solution of a 20-year-old case. The police at first denied the authenticity of the letter, then admitted the details matched. The information could not have been known to anyone outside. Edward watched the reaction with the detached interest of a man watching an anthill, knowing that soon it will be gone. He felt neither satisfaction nor fear, only a strange relief, as if the stone he had been carrying all his life had become slightly lighter. He sent the second letter a week later. This time it was about a girl whose body had been found in an abandoned house on the outskirts of town. The police had decided it was suicide. Edward described how he had lured her there, how he had forced her to take a lethal dose of sleeping pills, how he had carefully laid out the body, simulating suicide. And why? Because she had seen his face the night of the previous murder, although she had not realized it herself. She loved purple flowers, he wrote at the end. "Every year on the day she died, I bring a bouquet to her grave." No one ever wondered who the stranger with the flowers was. After the second letter, a real hunt began. The police created a special task force. Journalists dug into the ground looking for clues. Psychologists built profiles. Everyone was looking for a serial killer who suddenly decided to talk after decades of silence. No one was looking for a dying old man who simply wanted the truth not to die with him. Edward continued his strange confession. Each letter was a new story, a new victim, new details that only he could know. He wrote dryly, almost clinically, avoiding emotions and justifications. Only facts, only the truth, only what really happened. The city lived on his letters. TV shows analyzed every word. Experts theorized, and relatives of victims cried on live television, finally getting the answers they had been waiting for decades. And Edward watched it all from his small apartment, where the walls were covered with newspaper clippings, not of his crimes, but of his letters, of people's reactions, of how the truth he had kept for so long now took on a life of its own. The disease progressed faster than doctors had predicted. His fingers grew numb, refused to obey, and his handwriting became increasingly illegible. Edward switched to a typewriter, an old mechanical one with keys that had to be hit with force. Each letter now required hours of work. Each word was difficult, but he continued. In the 6th letter, he for the first time deviated from his rule. No emotions, only facts. He wrote about how he chose his victims, what he felt at the moment of the murder, how he lived with this knowledge later, without justifying himself, without asking for forgiveness, simply trying to explain the inexplicable. "I was not born a monster," he wrote. "I became one by choice. Every step along the way was my decision. Every life I took was taken knowingly. I cannot ask for forgiveness because I know that some things are unforgivable. I can only offer the truth, cold, brutal, but honest." The letter sparked a new wave of interest. Psychologists analyzed every sentence, trying to understand motives to build a profile. Religious leaders spoke of atonement and repentance. Philosophers discussed the nature of evil and the possibility of forgiveness. Edward watched all this with a bitter smile. They didn't understand. It wasn't about atonement. It wasn't about repentance. It wasn't about trying to ease his conscience before he died. It was about the truth, about it existing, pure and unvarnished, without excuses or softening, so that the world would know, this is what happened, this is who I was, this is what I did. At the Daily Chronicle, a young journalist named Alex Reed became the unofficial expert on the killer's letters. He was the first to notice the change in style, the first to suggest that the writer was terminally ill, the first to look not for a healthy middle-aged man, as the FBI profiles suggested, but for an older man, perhaps with a degenerative disease. Edward followed Reed's publications with growing interest. This young man understood what others did not. He did not try to find excuses or explanations. He simply listened to the voice in the letters and passed it on, without distortion or interpretation. In the 8th letter, Edward addressed Reed directly for the first time. "You are the only one who hears what I am really saying," he wrote. "Not what others want to hear, not the story of remorse or redemption, not the sensationalism or the horror. You hear the truth, plain and simple. For that, I am grateful." The pitch changed everything. Now Reed was not just a journalist covering a story, he was part of it. His phone was ringing off the hook. His email inbox was flooded with everything from threats to million-dollar book deals, and Edward kept writing. Each letter became more difficult, each word took more effort. But he couldn't stop. Not now that he'd found someone who actually listened. In the 10th letter, he hinted for the first time at his illness. "Time is passing faster than I expected," he wrote. "Soon, my voice will be silenced forever. But before that happens, I must tell everything. Every story, every sacrifice, every choice that led me to where I am today." Reed got the hint. In his next article, he addressed the letter writer directly, offering to meet. Not to expose, not to arrest, but simply to talk, so that the voice wouldn't disappear into silence. Edward stared at the article for a long moment. His fingers, now nearly useless, could barely hold the paper. His voice, once strong and confident, had become a hoarse whisper. His body was slowly becoming a cage with no escape, but his mind remained clear, and he knew it was time for the next step. The 11th letter was the shortest of all. "I am ready to talk," he wrote, "but not to the police, not to the prosecutors or the psychologists, only to you, Mr. Reed. Because you know how to listen not only to words, but to the silence between them." He gave a place and a time, a small cafe on the outskirts of town, Tuesday, 3 o'clock in the afternoon. A place where no one would pay attention to an elderly man with shaking hands and a young journalist, too engrossed in conversation to notice anything around him. After sending the letter, Edward felt a strange calm. Not relief, not fear, not anticipation, just a quiet recognition of the inevitable. The circle was closing. The voice that had been silent for so long would finally be heard fully. And then there will be silence. Martha's Cafe had been there on the corner of Oak Street and River Avenue since time immemorial. Faded sign, cracked tiles, the smell of coffee and baked goods that seemed to have seeped into the walls themselves. A place where no one asked unnecessary questions or made eye contact longer than necessary. Edward arrived half an hour early. His movements were slow, each step a carefully calculated action. The cane he used became an extension of his arm, a necessary support for a body that was betraying him more and more each day. He chose a table in the corner, with his back to the wall overlooking the front door, a habit he had never been able to break after all these years. Alex Reed arrived at exactly 3, not a minute earlier or later. A young man with tousled hair and watchful eyes that held not the excitement of a hunter on a trail, but the calm determination of a chronicler ready to record history without embellishment. He recognized Edward immediately, even though they had never met before. Something about the older man's posture, the way he watched the door, the way he held his cup with trembling fingers, everything gave him away as the man whose letters Alex had been studying for months. "Mr. Murphy," Reed said, sitting down across from him. Not a question, a statement. Edward nodded, his face impassive, but there was a flicker of something in his eyes. Not fear, not relief, just recognition of the inevitable. "You came alone," he noted. His voice was quiet, slightly hoarse, as if he had not spoken out loud for a long time. "As you requested," Reed replied. "No police, no recording devices, just you and me." Edward studied his face, looking for signs of deception or ulterior motives. But he saw only weariness and that special tension that comes when a man is about to hear something that will change him forever. "Why did you agree to this meeting?" Edward asked. "You understand who I am and what I have done." Reed didn't look away. "Because the truth is more important than my comfort. Because stories need to be told. All stories, even the dark ones, especially the dark ones." Edward allowed himself a slight smile, not a happy one, but rather one that acknowledged the accuracy of the wording. "Then let's start with the truth. Mr. Reed, I'm dying. Amyotrophic lateral sclerosis. My nerve cells are dying. My muscles are atrophying. Soon I won't be able to speak, breathe, move. My mind will remain clear, trapped in a useless body until the very end." He paused, taking a sip of coffee from the cup he held with both hands to hide his trembling. "That's not an excuse, not a reason for sympathy, just a fact that explains why I decided to speak up now." Reed nodded. He pulled out a notebook, an old-fashioned one with a tattered leather cover and a pencil. No recorder, no phone, nothing electronic, just paper and graphite. "Tell me everything," he said simply, "from the beginning." And Edward began to talk. About a boy who grew up in a quiet suburb, in a family where voices were never raised and doors were always closed to other people's problems. About a young man who discovered in himself a strange absence, not of emotion, but of its usual human flow. About a young man who learned to imitate normality, the way others learn a foreign language, methodically, with an accent, never becoming truly fluent in the skill. He spoke of the first murder, unplanned, almost accidental, but revealing something in him that he himself had not expected. Of the second, deliberate, methodical, with preparation and a well-thought-out retreat. Of the third, fourth, fifth, each with its own story, its own details, its own place in the dark mosaic of his life. Reed wrote, sometimes asking questions, not judgmental, not directive, just clarifying. He was neither judge nor confessor, only a chronicler, recording a story no one else could tell. The day outside was slowly fading, the light was becoming softer, the shadows were longer. The cafe was gradually filling up with evening customers, but no one was paying attention to the two men in the corner, deep in conversation, which from the outside seemed the most ordinary. "Were you ever afraid of getting caught?" Reed asked at one point. Edward thought about it. "Not afraid, no. I always knew it was possible. That every crime leaves traces that any system can fail. I was prepared for it. But as the years went, by investigations reached dead ends, witnesses died or forgot details, and gradually I became invisible. What's it like to be invisible? Reed's voice was not judgmental, only genuine curiosity. It's like being a ghost among the living, Edward said after a pause. You walk the same streets, breathe the same air, but you exist in a parallel reality. You see them, but they don't see you, the real you. They see the mask, the role you play, the librarian, the neighbor, the polite man across the street, but never you. He paused, collecting his thoughts. You know what the scariest thing about being invisible, Mr. Reed? It's not that others can't see you. It's that over time you stop seeing yourself. You become a collection of habits, rituals, carefully thought out actions. But somewhere along the way, the essence gets lost. The thing that makes you, you. Reed looked at him with an expression that was hard to read. Not sympathy, not disgust, but some deep, almost painful understanding. And that's why you started writing letters? To become visible again? Edward shook his head. No, I started writing because the truth shouldn't die with me. Because those who lost loved ones deserve to know what happened. Because stories need to be told. All stories, even the darkest ones. He repeated Reed's words with a touch of irony, but without mockery. But there is another reason, he continued after a pause. A more selfish one. I wanted at least someone to see the real me, without masks, without pretense, to see and not turn away, even if that look is the last thing I experience in this life. Reed closed the notebook, his fingers stained with graphite, his face frozen, with the expression of a man who had looked into an abyss and found that the abyss was indeed looking back at him. What do you want me to do with this story? He asked finally. Tell it, Edward replied simply. The whole thing, uncut and unvarnished. Don't make me out to be some horror movie monster, but don't try to find excuses where there aren't any. Just the truth. Pure and simple. Reed nodded. What will happen to you? Edward looked out the window at the street where the evening lights were coming on. The city was preparing for the night. People were hurrying home to the warmth and safety of their apartments, unaware that the man whose hands had taken so many lives was walking among them. I'll go home, he said quietly. I'll wait for the disease to finish its work. It won't be quick or easy, but it will be fair, in a way. He turned to Reed, something like a challenge flickering in his eyes. Will you try to stop me? Tell the police? Make sure I meet my end behind bars, like a criminal should? Reed looked at him for a long time before answering. I'm a journalist, Mr. Murphy. My job is to tell stories, not to dispense justice, and I gave you my word. Edward nodded, accepting the answer. He rose slowly, leaning on his cane, each movement made with visible effort. We'll see each other again, Mr. Reed. I've got a few more stories to tell, and not much time to do them. He left the money for the coffee on the table, the exact amount, no tip, and headed for the exit. His gait was uneven, but his back remained straight, as if he were carrying an invisible weight on his shoulders that he would not allow himself to throw off. Reed watched him go, until the old man's figure faded into the evening gloom. Then he opened his notebook and began to reread his notes. A chronicle of darkness, told by a voice that would soon be silent forever. That night, Edward couldn't sleep. He sat at his apartment window, looking out at the city that had never truly been his home, but had been the witness to his entire life. Meeting Reed had stirred up memories he had long buried under layers of time and indifference. He remembered faces, not his victims, strangely, but their features had long since faded from memory, becoming just blurred silhouettes in the fog of the past. No, he remembered the faces of people who had been there all these years, neighbors, colleagues, casual acquaintances, people who saw him every day, but never really saw him. Was it their fault or his own? He had created the perfect mask for himself, made himself invisible by choice. But somewhere deep inside, there was always a need to be seen, to be recognized, to be understood, even if that understanding brought with it horror and disgust. In the morning, he discovered that his right hand had almost completely given up. His fingers did not bend, his hand hung lifelessly. The disease was progressing faster than he expected. Time was slipping through his fingers like sand, and he had to finish what he had started. He called Reed. The journalist's number was in the paper under each of his articles. Edward's voice sounded weaker than the day before. The words came with difficulty, but his mind remained crystal clear. "I need to show you something," he said without preamble. "Come over this evening, at my place." He dictated the address and hung up without waiting for an answer. He knew Reed would come, not out of pity, not out of professional interest, but out of the same deep, almost painful understanding he had seen in the journalist's gaze yesterday. The day dragged on slowly. Edward prepared methodically for the visit, not as a normal person, would prepare for a guest, but as an archivist would tidy up documents before handing them over to a new custodian. He pulled a box from its hiding place behind the bookcase, an unremarkable cardboard box, darkened by time. Inside were the things he had kept all these years, not trophies. He had never been the kind of killer to collect souvenirs, more like evidence, proof, physical confirmation of the stories he told in his letters. Before and after photographs of crime scenes, newspaper clippings of disappearances and murders, a city map with dots marked, red for completed cases, blue for those still in the pipeline, and diaries, dozens of thin notebooks filled with small, neat handwriting. Not descriptions of murders. He remembered their details without writing them down, but observations of the city, of people, of himself. A chronicle of the inner life of a man who existed parallel to society, never fully becoming a part of it. The sun was setting when Reed arrived, painting the room in shades of amber and gold. Edward met him at the door, looking even more haggard than the day before, his right arm hanging limply at his side. "Come in, Mr. Reed," he said, stepping aside. "Welcome to the lair of the beast." There was no bitterness or sarcasm in his voice, just a tired statement of fact. Edward's apartment was exactly as Reed had imagined it, ascetic, functional, with a minimum of personal belongings. Bookcases lined the walls, simple furniture, no photographs or souvenirs. A place to exist, not to live. "I've gathered everything I have," Edward said, pointing to the box on the table. "All the evidence, all the records. They're yours." Reed walked over to the table but didn't open the box. Instead, he looked at Edward with an expression that was hard to read. Why me? Why not the police, the FBI? They could use this material to close the cases, give peace to the victims' families. Edward slowly sank into the chair. Movements were becoming increasingly difficult for him, each gesture requiring concentration and effort. "Because you won't judge," he said after a pause. "Not me, that would be fair. But the stories, you won't simplify them, force them into convenient patterns. You'll tell them as they are. Complex, dark, uncomfortable." He looked at his lifeless hand, then back at Reed. "And also, because you're the only one who really sees me. Not the monster, not the sensation, not the material for the article. Me, the man who did monstrous things, but remained a man." Reed was silent for a long moment, considering what he had heard. Then he nodded, accepting the responsibility Edward was placing on him. "I will tell your stories," he said at last, "all of them without exception, but I cannot promise that people will see in them what I see." "I'm not asking for that," Edward replied. "I'm asking only for the truth. The rest is not in our hands." He rose with visible effort and went to the window. The city beyond the glass was turning on its evening lights, preparing for the nightlife, unaware of the drama unfolding in the nondescript apartment on the 3rd floor. "You know what's strangest, Mr. Reed? I've lived my whole life hiding in plain sight, afraid of being discovered. And now that the end is near, I find that what I fear most is going unnoticed, disappearing without a trace, like those I took." There was no remorse in his voice, only weariness and a strange, almost philosophical acceptance of the irony of fate. Reed came and stood next to him at the window, two silhouettes against the evening city, young and old, healthy and dying, the chronicler in his darkest plot. "You will not disappear," Reed said quietly. "Your story will be told, not for your redemption or your memory, but for the truth, because the truth is more important than anything else." Edward nodded, accepting those words as the only promise that mattered. Outside the window, the city continued to live its life, unaware that one of its darkest secrets was about to come to light. Autumn in the city was always special, not a bright flash of color as in the suburbs, but a slow fading, a gradual transition from warmth to cold, from life to torpor. The leaves on the rare trees turned yellow and fell. The rains became colder, and the light became dimmer and more colorless. For Edward Murphy, this was his last autumn. He knew it with the same certainty with which he had once planned his crimes, methodically, without emotion, accepting the inevitable as a given, not a tragedy. The disease progressed faster than doctors had predicted. After his right arm, his left leg gave out. Then he began having problems with swallowing and speech. Every day took something else away from him. Every morning he woke up a little less whole than he had been the day before. But his mind remained clear. perhaps too clear. It was as if, as his body failed, his awareness grew sharper, his perceptions more subtle. He noticed details that had previously escaped his notice. The way the light in the room changed throughout the day, the sound of rain on the eaves, the smell of autumn air filtering through a loosely closed window. Alex Reed came every day, at first to continue the interview, to record the stories Edward had not yet told, then simply to be there, to listen, to observe, not out of pity or professional duty, but out of some deep, almost instinctive understanding. He was witnessing not just the death of a man, but the end of an era, the closing of a chapter in the history of a city that no one but he could fully read. They talked, a lot at first, then less and less as Edward's speech became more and more labored, about the crimes, the victims, the years spent in the shadows, about a city that was changing around them but deep down, the same, indifferent, absorbed in its own rhythms, oblivious to its heroes and its monsters. "Do you know what the strangest thing about murder is, Mr. Reed?" Edward asked one day. His voice was barely audible anymore, the words running together, but Reed had learned to understand him as one might understand a foreigner speaking a nearly forgotten dialect. Not the act itself, not the planning, not even the aftermath. It's how quickly it all becomes mundane, routine. How quickly the impossible becomes the familiar. Reed didn't answer, not because he didn't know what to say, but because he knew Edward wasn't expecting an answer. He was simply voicing a thought that had probably been haunting him for years. It's the same with dying. Edward continued after a pause. At first it seems impossible, incomprehensible. Then, just another task to complete, another item on the to-do list. He tried to smile, but his facial muscles were no longer obeying him, and the smile came out crooked, almost grotesque. It's funny, isn't it? After all, death and murder are just different sides of the same coin. The only difference is who controls the process. Reed recorded these conversations, not on a tape recorder. Edward still didn't trust electronics, but in his tattered notebook, page after page filled with stories, observations, the philosophical musings of a dying killer. Not a confession, not an apology, just a chronicle of the passing of a man who had lived outside society, but was now, at the end, seeking a way to leave a mark on a world that had always been alien to him. Reed's first article on the killer letters appeared in mid-October. It was not a sensational report, not a blatant exposé, a calm, almost clinical analysis of the phenomenon. He did not name Edward, did not reveal his whereabouts, but he described their meetings, their conversations, the dying process of the man whose hands had taken so many lives. The reaction was predictable: shock, outrage, demands for the immediate arrest of the criminal, indignation at the glorification of a killer. The police began an investigation, trying to get to Reed, to force him to reveal his source. But the young journalist was adamant. He had given his word, and he intended to keep it. Edward read the article with the same detached interest he had once shown when he read the accounts of his crimes. His hands could no longer hold the paper. And Reed read it aloud to him, slowly, letting each word sink into his consciousness. "You didn't sugarcoat it," Edward remarked when the reading was over. "You didn't make me a monster or a tragic figure. Just human. Isn't that what you wanted?" Reed asked. "The truth, without embellishment or justification." Edward nodded, one of the few movements still available to him. "Yes, but I wasn't sure you could do it. Most people can't handle the truth. They need categories, labels, villain or hero, monster or victim. Reality is too inconvenient." He paused, gathering his strength for the next sentence. "Do you know that they will come for you? The police, the FBI, everyone who has been looking for me for years. They will not forgive you for knowing and keeping quiet." Reed shrugged with a feigned indifference that didn't fool Edward. "I'm a journalist. My job is to tell stories, not to dispense justice." "Beautiful words." Edward's voice held a hint of irony. "But we both know it's not that simple. You've become an accomplice, not to my crimes, but to my final deception. My escape without punishment." Reed looked at him for a long time before answering. "Maybe. But I think your current state is also a kind of punishment. Maybe even more cruel than anything the justice system could come up with." Edward didn't answer. His gaze was fixed on the window, where the day was slowly fading, giving way to twilight. That strange, in-between time when the world seems suspended between reality and sleep. By early November, Edward could no longer speak. His vocal cords had given out, as had most of the muscles in his face. He communicated with Reed by blinking his eyes, once for yes, twice for no, a complex system for more complex thoughts. It was slow, tedious, but they were both patient. Edward because he had no choice, Reed because he knew that every conversation could be their last. The second article came out mid-month. This time, Reed was more specific, describing the crimes in detail that only the killer or someone who spoke to him would know. He didn't name the victims or give exact dates, but he gave enough information that police could connect the stories to unsolved cases. The reaction was even more furious. Television channels discussed the article in prime time. Experts theorized about the killer's identity and motives, and relatives of the victims demanded justice. The police increased the pressure on Reed, threatening to arrest him for obstructing justice, but he remained unmoved. "They think I'm protecting you," he told Edward during one visit. "But really, I'm protecting history, your history. Because once they find you, it's no longer yours. It's theirs, twisted, simplified, tailored to their needs." Edward blinked once. Yes, he understood. At the end of November, the first real cold weather arrived. The city was covered with frost. The trees stood bare and fragile, like skeletons. The sky acquired that special winter shade of gray that seems endless and hopeless. Edward could barely move. His body was a cage trapping his mind, still sharp, still aware of every second of its fading. He lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, counting the cracks, watching the light change as the day progressed. The nurse Reed had hired came in twice, a day to change IVs, check on him, perform the mechanical tasks necessary to sustain the life that was already fading. Reed came every night. He sat next to the bed, talking about the reaction to the articles, the progress of the investigation, the city's gradual descent into winter torpor. Sometimes he read aloud, not from newspapers or news stories, but from classic literature, philosophical treatises, poetry. Edward listened, his eyes, the only part of his body that was still completely under his control, watching Reed with the same intense attention he had once given to potential victims. One evening, when the first snow was falling outside, Reed brought a tape recorder. "I know you don't trust electronics," he said, placing the small device on the nightstand next to the bed. "But I thought, maybe you'd like to record something, a final message. I can help. I'll ask questions. You can answer by blinking. It's slow, but time is the only thing we have in abundance." Edward looked at the recorder for a long moment, then at Reed. His gaze was unreadable, not because he was trying to hide his emotions, but because his face could no longer express them. Finally, he blinked once. Yes, they worked on the tape for days. Reed asked questions, interpreted Edward's blinks, put his thoughts into words, checked for accuracy, edited. It was a slow, grueling process, but neither of them was in a hurry. They both understood the importance of this final testimony, not for remorse or vindication, but for closure on a story that had begun all those years ago with the first murder and was now coming to an end. The recording was long, almost 2 hours of monologue, punctuated by pauses and heavy breathing. Edward spoke in Reed's voice about his life, about his crimes, about the years he had spent in the shadows. But most of all, he spoke about the city, its indifference, its blindness, its ability to absorb and forget even the most terrible events. "I was not born a monster," Reed's voice echoed Edward's thoughts. "I became one by choice. Every step along the way was my decision. Every life I took was taken knowingly. I cannot ask for forgiveness because I know that some things are unforgivable. I can only offer the truth, cold, brutal, but honest." He paused, collecting his thoughts. "I am not dying as I should have, not at the hands of justice, not in a prison cell. I am going quietly, unnoticed, as I have lived most of my life. It is not fair to those I killed, to their families, to the society that deserves to see a criminal punished. But perhaps there is a kind of poetic justice in the fact that I end my days trapped in my own body, unable to move, to speak, to control even the most basic functions. A prison of flesh and blood, perhaps crueler than any created by man." When the recording was finished, Reed turned off the recorder and looked at Edward. In the dying man's eyes, he saw something he had never seen before. Not fear, not resignation, but some strange, almost peaceful acceptance. "What should I do with this footage?" Reed asked. "Should I publish it with the last article? Give it to the police? Keep it for history?" Edward blinked 3 times, the signal they had established for "I trust your decision." Reed nodded, accepting this final responsibility. December brought real winter, Snow, frost, short days and long nights. The city slowed down, went into hibernation. People hurried home from work, not lingering on the streets, not noticing the beauty of the snow-covered streets and frosty patterns on the windows. Edward was fading with each passing day. His breathing was becoming shallower, his pulse was becoming weaker, his skin had that waxy tint that only the very old or the very sick have. The nurse said it was a matter of days, maybe hours. Reed stayed by his bedside, reading aloud, talking about the city, the snow, the upcoming holidays. Not because he thought Edward would be interested, but because he didn't want him to go away alone and silent, like his victims had. Reed's third and final article came out in mid-December. In it, he finally revealed the identity of the letter. Writer, Edward Murphy, 62, a former librarian dying of amyotrophic lateral sclerosis. He described his life, his crimes, his final days, with the same dispassionate precision he had given in his previous articles. Not a monster, not a tragic figure, just a man who had made a monstrous choice and was now facing the consequences of that choice with the same cold acceptance he had once shown when he had decided to kill. The article caused a storm. The police immediately went to the address, but it was too late. Edward Murphy had died a few hours before publication. Quietly, without agony, he simply stopped breathing, with snow falling outside, and Reed reading him Moby Dick, a story of another obsession, another darkness, another ending. Reed was arrested on charges of obstruction of justice. He was interrogated for hours, threatened with jail time, and asked to explain why he had not disclosed the whereabouts of a wanted criminal. His answers were the same. "I'm a journalist. My job is to tell stories, not to dispense justice." In the end, they let him go, not because they believed him, but because they couldn't prove that he knew about Edward's crimes before he started writing the letters. Technically, he hadn't broken the law, only moral norms, only the unspoken rules of society. The recording they had made together, Reed gave to the police, a copy, not the original. Another copy he sent to the city library archives, with instructions not to open it for 50 years. The third he kept for himself, along with Edward's diaries, photographs, all the materials he had collected over the years. Not for the book, not for the sensation, for the truth, which was to outlive them both. Edward Murphy was buried in the town cemetery, in the far corner where the homeless and the unidentified were buried. There was no monument, no ceremony, just a wooden cross with his name and dates. Reed was the only one who attended the funeral. He stood in the falling snow, looking at the fresh grave, thinking about the strange twists of fate that had brought him here, to bid a final farewell to the man whose hands had taken so many lives, but whose voice now lived on in his words, in his writings, in a record that would be preserved long after they were both names in the archives. The city went on with its life. Snow fell, covering the streets with a white shroud, hiding dirt. Footprints, all evidence of human presence. People hurried about their business, oblivious to the beauty of winter. or the darkness that always lurked beneath the surface of their orderly lives. And somewhere in the archives, in the files of unsolved cases, in newspaper clippings, in the memories of those who lost loved ones, the story of Edward Murphy lived on. Not a monster, not a tragic figure, but a man who made his choice and met its consequences with the same cold acceptance with which he once made the decision to kill. There was no good or evil in this city, only voices that someone had to hear, and Alex Reed listened.